At this point, I'd like to introduce Professor Michael Thornton, who will serve as the moderator for our panel today. Professor Thornton teaches in the Afro-American and Asian American Studies and Sociology departments. His research focuses on the relationships among people of color, racial and multiracial identity, and mass media perceptions of the intersections between racial groups. This afternoon, Professor Thornton will moderate our faculty panel, and the focus will be civil rights today and in the future. So let's give him a warm welcome this afternoon.
Well, I guess normally one should get applauded after one does something, but thank you anyway. So good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you. Welcome to the final afternoon session of The Nation Still Under Construction. This is probably a conversation we should be having every year as opposed to every 50 years until we get it right. My name is, as mentioned, is Michael Thornton. I would be the moderator. I'm a sociologist who does primarily work dealing with people of color, but I also do community stuff, and that's probably my biggest passion. I'd like to tell you a little bit about what we're going to do the next hour, 15 minutes. I'll begin with kind of an overview or framing of the discussion about what's happened over the last 50 years. After that, I'll briefly introduce each of the panelists, probably as briefly as I just introduced myself. There's more details about each of them in the program for the conference if you want to follow up on that. After the introductions, we'll address 4 questions in turn. After each question and the responses by the panel members, I'll open up for a brief discussion for anyone in the audience who wants to say anything or testify or make comments, whatever. So let's begin. In late August of 1963, thousands of Americans left their hometowns and gathered together to march on our nation's capital to demand jobs and freedom. This assembly of concerned and angry citizens heard Martin Luther King Jr. lament that too many Americans lived on a lonely island of poverty in the midst of a vast ocean of material prosperity. Should sound familiar. The marchers had 10 demands for Congress, at least 4 of which were aimed at improving black people's financial circumstances and narrowing the white-black economic opportunity gap. This traditionally termed civil rights march was more. It was also one for economic rights. The movement that spurred this gathering also motivated Congress and the President to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made it illegal for employers to discriminate based on race. And the same Congress had passed the Equal Pay Act of 1963, which prohibited wage differentials based on sex. But there was more. This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America, stated our President, Lyndon Johnson, in January 1964. He went on, "It will not be a short or easy struggle. No single weapon or strategy will suffice, but we shall not rest until that war is won. The richest nation on earth can afford to win it. We cannot afford to lose it." Congress passed critical civil rights legislation in the Bipartisan Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, which created the legislative framework to expand economic opportunity via anti-poverty, health, education, and employment policies. Throughout much of the war on poverty and the larger Great Society effort, both Democratic and Republican administrations laid the foundation for a modern-day safety net, including the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, formerly known as food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, Head Start, and expanded Social Security. This movement also spurred policies providing funding that has enabled millions of students to go to college and opened doors to women, people of color, and working-class folks in a program called HUSH, Affirmative Action. Despite recent critics who see failure in anything related to people of color and working-class folks, the direct result of these efforts was the stirrings of a different nation. It was different in that it paid attention to the idea of democracy. While today we are more enamored with assisting the rich, the period of the 1960s to the 1980s was a time when we paid much more than lip service to the idea of a common good. We actually put major resources to this common good. In celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, we don't appreciate enough that this movement that brought it about overcame tremendous opposition and odds. After all, at the time, it was more than 100 years after the passage of the last great civil rights legislation. So in 1964, it seemed beyond impossible that this sort of legislation for civil rights writ large could ever come again. But the impossible became real. The Great Society and its goals have not failed us, but we and our economy have. Our economy and social fabric have changed significantly since 1964. In 50 years, demographic shifts, rising income inequality, and insufficient access to jobs and education pose new and continued policy challenges. Too often in 2014, our public policies have exacerbated these challenges. One important change since 1964 has been what we now target as the enemy. In 1964, it was a lack of access to resources, an unfair playing field, and poverty. Now our enemies are people, not issues, and certain people, poor people. And many single mothers are seen as a threat because they refuse to be self-sufficient and thus cause the rest of us great harm. Thus we shrink and devastate welfare budgets and make birth control much more difficult to obtain. How effective have we been in slaying this enemy? Almost half of us now are in or near poverty. As real crime rates have plummeted over the last several decades, in Wisconsin and nationally, we dealt with an imaginary crime wave by opening our prison doors, providing room and board for thugs of color. Room and board with a catch, of course, because this room and board is provided involuntarily. However, most of the people who are in prison will eventually get out, and once they get out, we mark them for life as disruptive forces aligned against our national security. And to counter this imaginary crime wave, we increasingly resort to legalized murder by common citizens, for example, via stand your ground laws. Our most obvious enemy today are perhaps Muslims, Middle Easterners, and those who look like them. In this war on terror, we have spent trillions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of lives and souls to protect us against international threats to our safety. So in 2014, discrimination and other lack of resources and poverty are not our enemies. Our new enemies list perceives international terrorists and certain American citizens as comparable threats to our safety. Given the resources we have spent threatening, imprisoning, and otherwise harassing these enemies, one should surmise that they are both actual threats to our national safety and indeed are our largest threats. Not figurative threats, but actual threats, one would surmise. What most of us learn when we are children is that we must be able to separate reality from fantasy. Does reality suggest that this enemies list actually reflects the most important threats to our national security? Are poor people, those who are locked up in our prisons, or even international terrorists, actually the largest threats to our nation's safety? Are there not more significant and actual threats undermining our national security? And where are they in America's most wanted list of threats to our well-being? How about threats to us in terms of well-paying jobs leaving our country and going elsewhere? How about the threats to working-class people who are losing their jobs through automation? How about low-wage jobs are more ubiquitous now than high-paying jobs? Many of our worse off than their parents, and too many are on treadmills to nowhere. But these aren't our threats, right? These aren't our enemies to our national security. How about single-parent households that have increased significantly over the past several decades, most of them headed by women? Low-wage jobs point to making survival for these and other kind of families much more tenuous than they've been in a long time. And in this, race and gender still make a difference in who is poor and who is not. Minorities and single women with kids are vastly poorer than whites and married couples. How about the gap between white incomes and the incomes of people of color that have stagnated over the last several decades? This is in large part because during the past 40 years, we have witnessed a stunning ascendancy of wealth among a very small portion of our population. This is both a moral and economic concern. The economy did not stagnate since the 1960s and 1970s. It grew, but its fruits went to a limited few of Americans. We have sunk so far that in income inequality measures, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, of 31 countries evaluated, we rank second from the bottom in terms of income equality. In 1964, the income gap used to be three-tiered: rich, middle class, and poor. In 2014, it's rich and the rest of us. Wealth and poverty are intimately intertwined. The wealth, political, and economic power of those at the top are eroding our democracy. And this concentration of wealth in so few hands makes it almost impossible to find resources to help those that are below them. And that's 90% of us. Thus, the actual and most important threats to us are not racial minorities, women, poor, or working class folks, or not even international terrorists. Our security concerns are misdirected. Wealth is creating the class of people who live off of the welfare of others. Indeed, many of these domestic terrorists, as I call them, claim their terrorism for our benefit. But even when they're making these outlandish statements saying that they messed up the economy and we should praise them for doing so, we give these sick individuals the benefit of the doubt, allowing them to continue on their merry way. We live in a self-proclaimed democracy. No matter how one defines this term democracy, a key component to a real, thriving democracy must be the attention to the common good, to the common welfare. We attended to the common good in 1964 and many years later. With skyrocketing gaps between the top 5% and the rest of us, we are not attending to the common good in 2014. America has accomplished much over the last 50 years, but America has a lot more to accomplish before we even come close to this term democracy. So at least that's how I frame our discussion today. So let me introduce each of these panelists. I appreciate the applause if we're all doing something. I don't want this applause to mean nothing. So let me see if I can go in order, starting at the end. Again, very brief introduction. Patty Lowe is a professor of Department of Life Sciences Communication. She's the author of, award-winning author of Indian Nations of Wisconsin, Histories of Endurance and Renewal. Stephen Kantrowitz is next. He's a professor in the Department of History who has to run off early to deal with a crisis in his department. I'll leave it up to him to decide whether to tell you what that crisis is. But he's the author of More Than Freedom, Fighting for Black Citizenship in a White Republic, 1829 to 1889. Then Carrie Sperling. Oh, I missed one. Sorry, I don't know these two. Ellen Samuels is the author of Fantasies of Identification, Disability, Gender, Race. Then Carrie Sperling is the professor. Sperling has a broad range of practice, teaching, and management experience. Her legal experience is focused on civil rights and post-conviction litigation. Last but not least, Benjamin Marquez, a professor of political science, the author of Mexican-American Political Organizations, Choosing Issues, Taking Sides. For those of you who are detail-oriented, there's supposed to be one other person on the panel, but he could not make it for a family emergency. So what I'll do now is I'll read the first question that the panelists will respond to. They all may respond to it if they want to, or only a few. It's up to them. And then I'll open up the discussion to the rest of you. What are the new civil rights challenges facing us today? Do they differ from those that we faced in 1964? Anyone who wants to jump in?
Well, since we were the First Nations, I guess I'll go first.
Excellent.
I think the problems that Native people faced 50 years ago are still the same problems we face today. Invisibility, stereotypes, and a lack of understanding about sovereignty. I tried desperately to find statistics, and this really speaks to my first point about invisibility. I tried to find statistics of poverty among Native people 50 years ago, and they don't exist in any of the usual documents that I was able to find, the White House report, for example. But I do know that in 2012, Native Americans were the communities of color who were most likely to live in poverty. 34.2% of Indian people live below the poverty level. We still face stereotype issues. For some reason, we seem to have moved past stereotypes involving other groups of color, but We're still comfortable with the professional football team in our nation's capital carrying a very, very, very insulting mascot name. We're willing in this state to turn back the clock and make it easier for schools to keep their race-based mascots. And as far as sovereignty, I think it was 50 years ago, states routinely suppressed Indian treaty rights. This state did. 25 years ago we were in the middle of one of the most violent periods in this state's history with clashes over Ojibwe spearfishing, rights that were held by the Ojibwe by treaty that were ultimately affirmed by the US Supreme Court. But even today, those same Ojibwe communities are facing open pit taconite mines. Other nations in this state are facing frac sand mines that are compromising water and air quality. And so those treaty rights still are not understood or respected. I'll stop there.
All right. I want to come at this from a slightly different angle from maybe historians' more abstract angle, and suggest that one of the civil rights challenges facing us is the same civil rights challenge that always has faced us, which is that civil rights as written in law are fundamentally individual rights. They don't speak directly to dignity, belonging, equality, inclusion, the things that we take civil rights to mean often. And I think that's because we sometimes fail to make a distinction between Civil Rights Act and legislation and civil rights movements. They're quite different things often. Movements have always preceded and caused civil rights acts, whether we're talking about the Civil Rights Acts of 1866 and 1875, or the Civil Rights Acts of 1957, 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 65. The movements are what generate the energy that forces the legislation. The legislation doesn't mean everything the movement does, and if the movement doesn't continue, the legislation soon proves only to validate individual claims and not to create or perpetuate the sense of social belonging, inclusion, and equality that animated the movement and seemed to make the legislation necessary to begin with. I'll stop there.
Well, I wanted to, I didn't want to repeat what has been said, but I think I had a list of here things to say about, to respond to the first question, mostly echoing what Michael had already said. But Steve and I share an interest in social movements, and I wanted to respond or play off of what he had just said. I actually have a new book that just came out this year. Soon to be available in paperback, great for large section classes. But what I did was I was interested in a phenomena that I'd witnessed growing up in Texas, and most of the research that I do is in part designed to answer personal questions. And what I saw at the time was that Texas, when I was growing up in Texas during the 1950s and the 1960s, was that there was a change in the state's politics. And my parents were very active politically, and what I saw was the beginnings of the election of Latino officials, mostly Mexican American, political representatives in Texas, and it led me to ask a question, and that is how did they do it? And the larger question was how did political activists, how did activists and social movement organizations integrate Texas electoral politics after World War II? And there's a lot of reasons for it. I have five different explanations that I integrate into my historical analyses. And I'm more of an historian these days than a political scientist. So if you want me, I will come right on over. Anyway, but one of the things that I found was that institutions really matter. And during the civil rights movement, and I mean going back to the 1940s, people of color were outsiders to the political party system, and they were struggling to get in. And their presence and their integration of the party system had profound consequences for minority representation and minority power. And I found that I found a couple of things. One was that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 really mattered. It really empowered people of color. It empowered Latinos in Texas. And the protections of the act strengthened their hand. It made it possible for them to mobilize and to effectively elect people that represented them better, perhaps more, that they were also able to elect more people of color into public office. So they got better representation. And in fact, then and even today, people of color in public office are some of the most progressive members of state legislatures, the U.S. Congress, and sometimes the Senate. And well, we can argue back and forth on our president, but I believe that's the case there as well. But what did it mean to gain access to these institutions? It meant that you were then governed by the rules and the limitations of that institution. And I found this to be, these institutions, and I found this to be quite an ironic outcome. And that is, the results were that minority public officials became part of the institutions of governance, which involves constant negotiation and compromise. Social movements tend to be pretty absolutist, they tend to be militant, they tend to be non-compromising until you get to the table, and then they start again. But once you're in an institution, once you're in a state legislature, once you're a member of the Democratic Party, which is what they integrated first, you have to negotiate. And this negotiation drags people on into extended processes of back and forth and horse trading. And they have to engage in the politics of coalition building. And in the 1950s, building coalitions in the Democratic Party meant that you were building coalitions with people that really didn't care for you and didn't have your interests at heart. And this is where they were confined. The Republican Party was no much better, and this is where they had to work. And much of the time, their ideas were either watered down or rejected altogether. So it became kind of a trap. You succeed, but yet you're confined in other ways. I also found, I have a strong and a weak aspect of this argument, and one is that I believe that the character of minority representation changed over time. And that is, those that initiated the first bid to integrate Texas party politics had their roots in community organizations. They were part of social movements. And they believed that the best way to change the political system was to have roots in both, to be a Democratic Party activist, but also to be a community activist, in order so you could use both as a way of leveraging influence for your community. I found that over time, this connection began to be severed. That it began to be separated, that we began to see the emergence of a political class of minority politicians. Politicians who assembled coalitions, who assembled support outside of the minority community. Actually, this is the process of getting elected. Unless you have an absolute majority in the district from which you're elected, you have to reach out to other groups. And more those that were elected no longer had these strong community social movement roots. They would go to them, they would politic to them, they would make appeals to them, but they were no longer bound by them. They were bound by an electorate. And those that disagreed, those that insisted upon having this continued connection to community politics, or had the politics endorse the politics of militants and disruption, found themselves increasingly isolated, driven out of the party, or they just lost elections when they ran. But anyway, I want to stop there, so I won't take everybody's time. But I'll stop there.
Thank you. So I'm a little different from the other panelists, I think, because I study cultural representations. I'm in the departments of gender and women's studies and English, and I do what they call cultural studies. So I'm going to address this question through the Grammys. How many people watched the Grammys? At the Grammys this year, there was a sort of perfect storm of cultural, civil rights, equal rights mediations, as we say. So Macklemore and Ryan Lewis performed their hit song Same Love, which they produced explicitly to support a referendum for marriage equality in Oregon. And it's these two white straight guys performing a hip hop song with a white queer woman singing, I don't know the correct musical term, the best part of the song. And, and frankly, Mary Lambert, she often goes unnamed. Well, Queen Latifah, who had been deputized, married a group of couples in the audience, both same-sex and opposite sex, and then most absurdly, Madonna came out and started singing with Mary Lambert. So, obviously, on a very basic level, that wouldn't have happened 50 years ago for a number of reasons. Certainly, so many reasons. Certainly, what we see there is that there are ways the landscape has certainly changed on many levels, and looking at marriage equality, that movement as a civil rights movement that has a great deal of momentum right now. We have 17 states right now who've legalized same-sex marriage and 2 more pending in the courts, Utah and Michigan. And it has become what's seen as the LGBT civil rights movement of our time, which I'll say more about later, what it means that it's come to mean that. But certainly, you know, every year in my intro class, I give a lecture about the politics of marriage, and I have to update my slide with more and more states that have legalized same-sex marriage. So there's change there, right? You still have a politics around it that involves Macklemore and Ryan Lewis in their hit song needing to make it very, 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 very clear that they are not gay, and they're just supporting the gay people because they like girls. You have Queen Latifah, who's sort of openly closeted, what we call an open secret, who has not felt comfortable or made the choice to come out publicly, even though it's kind of an open secret. And you have the racial politics of Macklemore also winning the best hip-hop album that night and beating out the African-American contenders who even he tweeted afterward should have won. So you have racial politics and sexual politics all wrapped up in this package that I think more than anything wants to pretend that we're living in a society where all of these problems have been solved, right? So you have the gay couples and the straight couples all getting married together, and you have the white and the African-American musicians all singing together, and it's all good. And of course, you know, you can juxtapose that to many ways in which it seems, as the other panelists have mentioned, many other examples I can think of ways it seems like we're where we were, and I think voting rights is a really main area of that, right? Reproductive rights is another area where it seems like, wait, we're fighting this battle again, right? There are people, particularly in the southern United States, who've voted through poll taxes, voted through literacy tests, voted through all the things that were overturned by the Civil Rights Movement, the Voting Rights Act, who are now going to be banned from voting because they don't have the proper IDs, right? So you have this sense of going backwards, but crucially of needing to recognize it's in a new guise, right? I mean, the world has changed. You can't have race-based voting requirements anymore, right? Or gender-based or any of those categories now, but you can have voting requirements that enact the same inequalities. So it's the separation between the law as written and what it produces in the world, and that, I think, is the different guise, to go back to how the question's phrased.
I think picking up on a couple of points, first of all, we have this, you know, I think Jessica Williams did a number on The Daily Show about how we have a black president now, so we don't have racism, obviously. And sort of the same thing goes for, you know, we've got an openly lesbian U.S. senator in this state. She can't get married here, right? And she could be prosecuted for getting married elsewhere. So, you know, we live in a time of contradictions, and I think that's partly because the law follows social movements, it doesn't create them. And so the Civil Rights Act of 1964 created great promise and has done a lot to bring about change. But the law is not adequate to really address what's happened since. And you know, I think we have to be reminded to be wary of, in the case, the Bakke case, an affirmative action case out of California, the Supreme Court, in the majority opinion, talked about a colorblind constitution, sort of drawing from the language of the civil rights movement, but was warned by black men in dissent that, you know, be careful about that colorblind constitution phrase, because it can do some damage to you, because colorblind isn't actually what we were after. That we do need to look at the world and what happens to people based on categories and types. And so, you know, my area right now mostly is criminal law. And I co-direct the Innocence Project here at the law school and the Remington Center. And, you know, when you look at just the criminal justice system, which there's been many references to, you know, how do people even get caught up in the criminal justice system? Well, you know, after moving to Wisconsin, I find out that, well, in Milwaukee, it's because you're black, right? So you're 13 times more likely to be stopped if you're black in Milwaukee in a white neighborhood than, you know, if you're white. The stop and frisk laws in New York, of course, have been shown to be racially biased. We're showing that suspensions from school, completely racially biased in the way that it gets implemented. What happens when you're drawn into the system? Well, there's a really wonderful book called Indefensible by David Feige, and where it really talks about these, even just misdemeanors, petty things. You know, people spend days in jail. They lose their jobs. Because they lose their jobs, they lose their apartments. They lose everything. And so, in order to say you're innocent and fight the charges, you know, you have to spend time in jail and miss out on a job and maybe lose your kids in the process. So it's just not worth it. So we have this system where people are pleading guilty just to get a break, just so they can go back to work, so that they can make a living to make a family. What happens when people commit crimes? Well, similar crimes don't get similar punishments, right? I mean, we all know about the disparities between crack cocaine and powder cocaine penalties. 100 to 1 times the sentencing punishment for crack cocaine, because, well, you know, I mean, I guess when people enacted the law, you can't necessarily say they had racist intent, and this is the problem, right? But the disparities in the punishment fell very heavily on the black community. And in Arizona, we represented a man named Lewis Harper and finally got him out of prison. He had a 50-year sentence for selling $20 worth of crack cocaine. And you wonder, how do you get a 50-year sentence for selling crack cocaine? He didn't have a record. He had a charge for possession and a charge for sale to an undercover cop. And the judge was back in chambers with the lawyers, heard in the courtroom the family talking, and said something like, "I don't really like that jive talking in my courtroom," and went back out and gave him the maximum punishment and ran the sentences consecutively, so he'd have to serve 2 25-year sentences. And it took a lot of politics to get him out. The law wouldn't help him, but we were able to come together with a lot of leaders in the community and get him out. What happens when we think a crime might have occurred, but we're not sure? Well, if there's a black person around, a crime occurred, and we had that. Also, when I came here from Arizona, we had the Lewis Taylor case where the Pioneer Hotel burned down in 1970. It was the largest hotel fire before the MGM in Las Vegas. 29 people died. Before the fire was ever even put out, they had arrested a 16-year-old black kid named Lewis Taylor, who was there helping people out of the fire. And you know, the theory was he just didn't belong there. And before the fire was even put out, they had charged him with arson. So no investigation had occurred at that time. And in fact, the investigation that did occur after was pretty much based on the fact that they had this young kid named Lewis Taylor in jail. We finally got 40 years later, we got the investigator to say that his theory of the case, he had a profile. The profile was that of a young black male, because young black males, when they don't have things, you know, when they're in poverty, they like to go around and like burn things that other people have. And he said that under oath in a deposition, amazingly enough. So Lewis Taylor spent 40 years in prison for a crime that probably never was a crime. There was really good evidence that this was a accidental fire, and no proof that it was arson. And then what about the death penalty when we actually assert the worst penalty you can get for any crime? Of course, now I think we've all been educated in the fact that it's a very racist way of enacting. And when we give juries discretion to decide who gets the ultimate penalty, they use their own biases, which we all have, not only on race, but we had a case out of Texas when I was there of a man who killed his homosexual lover, and the judge sentenced him to, well, the prosecutor argued to the jury that he deserved death because prison is no punishment for a homosexual. So what we confront is I think what you know, social psychologists might call the naive realism of, you know, we think the world is the way we perceive it, and if a law's, you know, not racist on its face, then it's going to be implemented in a way that it has no racial bias, and that if people get caught up and arrested, it's merely because they commit more crimes. And if they do more time in prison, it's because they do more serious crimes. But what we've learned now since 1964 is that the data shows that that can't possibly be right.
On that happy note, I think clearly what we've all been saying up here is that 1964 was a watershed year, but many things have changed, but in some sense the laws haven't changed that much, at least in terms of the outcomes. Maybe the intent was very different since that time, but the outcomes really leave a lot of questions in terms of what we're actually doing here. So I want to open up the floor for at least a couple questions or comments from anybody who's interested. And I'll try to run around with this. There's a mic over there.
Hello, hello.
Yep.
I wonder if the panel could address the tool of media reform, media literacy. You know, it's, I think, actually called media justice as it applies to civil rights. There was a reform movement that arguably started here in Madison about 12 years ago with a convention that since has traveled around the country. And I guess the other thread I wanted to bring up is someone who returned as an adult, returning a student from 2006 to 2010. I think, and someone who's worked on issues of civil rights all of my life, I think that some of the breakthrough moments I had during that time were to understand how media portrayals, how learning in Hemant Shaw's class about the portrayals in movies over the years that have maligned so many different groups. And then I think as much as anything in Patty's class, having learned about the invisibility of Native American and Indigenous people, stories that should be out there that just aren't, simply because of prejudice and a suppression, a conscious suppression of being able to tell stories. I think there's two dimensions. I think one is in the realm of self-empowerment, how important it is for young people who come from minority communities to be able to see themselves and see authentic portrayals of who they are and who they could be. But I think also for the communities at large, it's so important for media depictions, you know, to be authentic, not to perpetuate stereotypes, but to show the full spectrum of who people can be. Just wonder if you could, again, comment on media reform and what we could do to bring about a day when there are more accurate portrayals.
Everybody's looking at
Everyone's
me. Quick, can anybody name a Native American television personality? No, I retired 2 years ago. No, quick. What? He's Native American? I didn't know that. It's a bit invisible for a Native American. But this is one of the problems. Native Americans are terribly underrepresented in the nation's newsrooms and in both print and television. Blacks, Hispanics are disproportionately overrepresented as either perpetrators of crime or victims of crime, and underrepresented as just general sources. You know, the local television station does a story about Roth IRAs. When's the last time you saw the financial expert be Native American? You know, never. It never happens. One of the real problems is, since 2008, as you probably know, the rate of unemployed journalists was 3 times higher than the unemployment rate in the general population. And with all the consolidations and the FCC reforms, we have, you know, major newspapers going dark, journalists of color who were disproportionately represented in entry-level positions, last hired, first fired, so we're disproportionately affected by those consolidations and layoffs. You know, every year I ask my classes how many of, you know, I ask my students how many of you read a printed newspaper, an actual newspaper, and that number has been going down. This year was the first time no one raised their hand. They all read news online, but now we don't even know what news is. I mean, there's so much news that's being selected for people and hasn't been vetted, and I think we're still figuring out the digital world of news, and that to me is where the future, if there's going to be some equalization, and I think that's where it's going to lie, but I just don't know what it's going to look like.
Have you seen cases where media activism, people doing the kind of work you do in class, have had a positive?
Well, sure, and I still think some of the mainstream media have effects. You know, the 60 Minutes and the Sunday mornings have an impact. But I've also seen social media mobilize people. It's just, journalism is such a murky landscape right now, we just don't even know what it looks like.
Yeah, I would add, I agree with everything that you're saying, and I would add the really disturbing tidbit that I found out just from knowing people involved in the making of the movie Pocahontas, that they based the animated character Pocahontas on 4 different women, none of whom were Native, and merged them into this ideal Native woman, right? So the issue is it's very complex, because, you know, when you're creating an animated figure, what is it being faithful to, right? I think that I'm a little more hopeful that digital media is democratizing media at the same time that it's changing it, and I am very concerned about, you know, hard-hitting investigative journalism and what's happening to that.
Absolutely.
I think that in terms of people being able to create self-representations, create web series, create blogs, create Tumblrs, the other things my students teach me about that I don't understand. The fact that when Netflix decided to create, you know, the first TV series done by Netflix, it was also the first ever any kind of mainstream representation in which a trans woman of color appeared and was played by a trans woman of color, who has been able to, Laverne Cox has been able to, despite Katie Couric, achieve a mainstream media voice, and is like just doing huge things. So I'm hopeful at the same time that I agree with all the problems.
We could probably have to move on to the next question. Sorry.
Give it
Huh?
very quick.
Michael, can I add one
Very
more?
quick.
Michael, can I add just
I'm
one little
afraid-
anecdote?
I'm afraid we're going to. Okay. Go for it.
Can I add just one little anecdote? An example of a mainstream media report that made a difference was actually a report that appeared in the Huffington Post. And it involved a high school in Wisconsin, Lakeland Union High School, where the math teacher had taught a lesson where the math answers corresponded to a letter in the alphabet. And the question was, what happened after Chief Shortcake died? And the math answer, when decoded, was Squaw Berry Shortcake. This is 2014 at a high school that has upwards of 30% of Native kids among the student population. So when that story hit, the fur flied, and the teacher apologized, and the district, launched an investigation. And so, there are still examples like that where the media are making a difference.
So I'll allow one more question, and then we'll have to move on.
This is not a question, it's a testimony. Petty Lowe, thank you for your remarks, because what you just said, that example you just gave, is all the more reason why the University of Wisconsin must maintain a strong Native American program. This is why we must have a strong Latino, Chicano program, Asian American program. And Professor High, thank you very much for the historical background you gave for Afro-American Studies, the Department of Afro-American Studies. We are very relevant, we are needed. And I want everybody in this room to know that there are rumors out here about mergers and consolidation. You use that word, it makes me cringe, of rumors of consolidating all the programs that deal with ethnic studies. This is not coming from the Department of Afro-American Studies. It's coming from the administration. And if you people here care about ethnic studies, if you care about Afro-American studies, Native American studies, Asian American studies, and Chicano Latino studies, you need to get busy and do something and make some noise. Thank you very much.
This is in some ways a new civil rights movement that needs to happen, right? Because what's been happening is, as several of the panelists have mentioned, that we're moving into this colorblind era where therefore we don't need these separate discussions about these groups that are very much negatively affected by what's happening. So on that note, second question. So what does the present day civil rights movement look like?
Let me just hit that quickly. I think I can think of two things that the present-day civil rights movement looks like. One is it looks a little bit like the civil rights movement of 50 years ago. It looks like the Moral Monday movement in North Carolina. It looks like a multiracial, multi-regional, multi-class coalition organizing around common principles, not necessarily with a common vernacular or a common set of backgrounds, but an abiding conviction that the status quo, as Michael laid it out for us at the beginning, the status quo cannot work for most people, and you need to find languages to explain to most people that their interests are not being served by the way things are. That movement is functioning, is growing, though it hasn't won political victories yet, has driven the sitting governor's popularity ratings down into the low 30s, I think, and is doing a great job of mobilizing people on a week-to-week basis to try to imagine not just what different policies might look like, but what it might look like to be in a movement together, and to see people you didn't used to think of as allies. So groups that have been pitted against one another, sometimes for reasons, sometimes not, like, for example, LGBT people and the Black church, need not be enemies, in fact can, and in that movement are allies. Very powerful stuff, very resonant, and a movement, second point, filled with great joy. And for that reason, I think the second thing is that the civil rights movement of today looks like Roberto Rivera. It looks like joy, spark, organized toward the cultivation of people's sense of worthiness, dignity in community. And I think that can happen in an elementary school as much as it can in the state capitol in Raleigh or in Madison. I think that's what's happening.
Again, I guess I'm going to follow Steve's lead on everything. I think you're absolutely right about the new civil rights movement having to be a multiracial coalition. But one of the things we need to think about, and this is something I emphasize with my students all the time, is that Latinos are now the largest racial and ethnic group in the United States. But I believe that Latinos are the wild card in America's racial landscape. And their racial and cultural characteristics has spawned a lively debate in the literature. And three main questions are asked. Well, one is, are Latinos just another ethnic group? Are they going to follow the same path that white ethnics did in the 20th century? As one of my old professors used to say, he's still around, he used to say, Latinos are the new Italians, and they're eventually going to incorporate themselves into the American mainstream. Another is, perhaps Latinos are in the process of constituting a third race. That the boundaries are such and they're strong enough that they will constitute a third race along with, maybe a fourth race along with Asians, whites, and African Americans. So this is a theory of becoming a third racial category. Or another possibility, or you can combine these, add and subtract, is that Latinos perhaps are part of a racial continuum. If you've ever lived around Latinos for very long, you've recognized that continuum. Some Latinos are very light skinned, some with blue eyes, European features. Others are very, very dark, with dark skin, indigenous features, African features. Perhaps there's this continuum that makes a difference in American society, and the color line will be drawn somewhere along that continuum, with lighter skin Latinos assimilating and darker skin Latinos not. So I think this adds a complexity that wasn't as evident during the 1960s, even though Latinos were there during the civil rights movement. This has become a pivotal issue, and this is something that the Republican Party is struggling with right now. What are we going to do with the Latino voters if we keep demonizing them? They're all going to be thrown together, and they're all going to vote for the Democrats time after time again. But I think this is a question. I think it's up in the air, and that really complicates this notion of what exactly constitutes a multiracial coalition.
And yeah, I guess we're all like freestyling up here. I think that following up on Steve's comments as well, to think about how today's civil rights movement looks or does not look like that of 50 years ago, I think also depends on what stories are told about. I know you don't think about history that much, Steve, but and so I want to tell briefly a story about the least known civil rights movement in this country, which is the disability rights movement. It's the one with no month. It's the one none of my students have ever heard of until they take my class. It's the one most people don't know, that there was a civil rights movement that produced laws like the Americans with Disabilities Act. And before the ADA was passed, the real birth of the disability rights movement were the Section 504 protests. And I'm going to be very brief here. I'm happy to say more if people have questions. For the first time, when the Rehabilitation Act of the US that had been passed over and over as a Health and Human Welfare Act, when it was reauthorized in 1973, they added a section called Section 503 that said any organization or institution receiving federal funds could not discriminate against an otherwise qualified handicapped individual. This was the first time civil rights language was put in the bill, and it was derived directly from the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But the authorities charged with somehow implementing Section 504 were like, I don't know what to do with that, and I don't really want to do anything with that. So nothing was done. Nothing was done to implement this civil rights aspect to eliminate discrimination against disabled people. So In April of 1977, after having attempted a number of legal pathways, a group of disabled people and their allies took over the health and human welfare offices in a number of major cities and had sit-ins to demand that they implement Section 504. And the largest sit-in was in the San Francisco office. It lasted for 25 days. And it was a largely white group of people with both physical and mental disabilities. It included 2 African-American disabled men who were members of the Oakland Black Panthers. And as a result, the Black Panthers became involved in supporting the protests. So the Black Panthers came every day and brought a hot dinner and met with a lot of resistance and had found all these backdoor ways to smuggle in this hot dinner. And then other community groups started coming. A Chicano group called the Mission Rebels started bringing breakfast. The Delancey Street, which was an organization for previously imprisoned people, started bringing food. The Butterfly Brigade, which was a gay men's kind of patrol of the streets for safety of gay men, brought them walkie-talkies. I love that detail, that historical detail. They brought them walkie-talkies. So you had this kind of amazing multi-identity coalition, multi-cause coalition around supporting this particular civil rights movement. And it's not something that's like in the history books of any of these different movements except the disability rights movement. And so I bring it up to say, I think that it has always been more of an integrated movement than the history books tell us, and that is the direction it's certainly going now.
I'm glad there are very hopeful people on the panel because I have some worries and fears. And one is, I guess because I deal in the legal arena most of the time, that it worries me that there are privileged groups that have been using the Constitution sort of as a sword to attack the disadvantaged groups rather than a shield to protect themselves. And so they're kind of carrying this mantle of the Civil Rights Act. So I'm thinking of the case argued yesterday before the Supreme Court, Sebelius versus Hobby Lobby, where corporations now are claiming that they have a right to free exercise of religion. That means that their free exercise of religion means that they shouldn't have to purchase health plans for their employees that involve contraception for women. And so they want the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court might very well buy an argument that corporations now have a free exercise of religion right under the Constitution that they can use as a sword to discriminate against their employees or others, really. And then the same kinds of things are happening, you know, the Arizona law that was passed by the legislature but not signed by the governor that would allow businesses in Arizona to discriminate, to basically just ignore the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and other laws that have come since then, if it's your religious belief that you shouldn't have to serve certain people. And then, you know, there's the other, you know, sort of privileged groups. So you just look at Florida and other states where, you know, we're trying to give people the right to carry guns around so that they can use their own discretion about who might threaten them, and guess who's going to be threatening them. So far, it seems like young black males. And then they can exercise their God-given rights under the Constitution to, you know, kill people they feel threatened by. So my real worries is that, you know, we fought for the protection of the disadvantaged and the people who aren't privileged in society, but of course they have more money and more power, and they're finding a way to use these kinds of laws to protect the privileged.
I'll keep my remarks very short. Our civil rights movement in Indian country, our Red Power movement, has always been a little different. Where other groups of color have tried to assimilate, our battle has been for the federal government and state governments and municipal governments to recognize our sovereignty and allow us to self-determine our future. And so the melting pot notion isn't really something that, you know, we're interested in. We don't want to melt. We want opportunity, and we're proud of our citizenship in the United States, but we're also proud of our tribal citizenship, and we just want to be able to protect our languages, protect our treaty rights, and protect our traditional cultures.
I'm sorry to say that I was just notified that we're going to have to wrap up within the next 3 minutes. Apparently there's something else happening that they have to prepare for. So I don't think I could do justice to all what has been said. But I think what I'll leave you with is this idea that we definitely need a new civil rights movement. We need something that involves all of us. As I was suggesting in my brief comments, that we now live in a society where you have the top 5 to 10% who continually gets most of the resources that should be available to all of us. And trying to do things in isolation from each other will not change that pattern. So one of the things we need to do is find a way to kind of work together, and I think in large part to begin to kind of counteract the laws that are now popping up all over the place. So with that in mind, I'd like to thank the panel for your contributions for today's discussion, and for the rest of you who have participated as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.